You're on. Welcome to Tutoring 2 for the final exam. And I want to recognize Letty Johnson for being my only student here. She saved you guys. All right. Okay, I wanted to pick up just one topic from the first half. As you remember, we talked about that the first half of the final, the 40%, would be on the first 3 units that we had. And I did want to pick up one little topic that I didn't feel like I got to go into as much yesterday that I think you need to remember, which is information about the fungi and the protozoans. So as far as the fungi go, one of the things that I want you to be sure that you remember that fungi have cell walls also, as do the bacteria, but remember that fungi are eukaryotic, so they also have a membrane and they have a nucleus, whereas the bacteria don't. So that was one of the things that we learned yesterday, or that we reviewed yesterday. Now, one of the things that make the fungi unique is that they have chitin, and that is a unique substance. It's a polysaccharide. It's unique to fungus only. And so that's something that we like to remember about them, because that's a substance that you only find in that particular organism. And that's a very important constituent of the fungal wall. Now, the algae and the fungi also have cellulose, and so that's another constituent of the cell walls. But again, we don't get into the algae as much because they don't cause human disease, except in some very rare instances. So we're really more interested in the fungi. Okay, now, here's something that I want to be sure that you guys understand, because we ended up using this in our later chapters when we began to look at the individual fungal infections. And it was the whole concept of the 2 forms of the fungus. The fungus exists in 2 forms. And so here you see the word yeast and you see the word mold. And the major difference between the yeast and the mold is that the mold is multicellular, whereas the yeast is single-celled. And if you recall, when we talked about the yeast, we talked about the way that they exist as a single cell, and then they bud to reproduce, and then eventually that bud grows to the size of the mother cell, and then the mother-daughter cell splits off. And so that's kind of like the typical yeast, a single cell organism. The molds then, they have several different structures, and I kind of think of them as like the plants of the microscopic world. So they will have a hyphae, and then at the end, that hyphae will branch off. And then at the very end of the hyphae, often then you will see structures like this. And in those structures that you see on the end of the hyphae, these are actually spores. And spores are like seeds, and they give rise to new plants or new fungi. Okay, so that is the other thing though that's really interesting or important to us as far as human disease goes is some of the worst fungi actually will produce, will be able to exist in both of these forms. And the significance of that is that if a mold can, or if a fungus can exist as a mold and a yeast and go back and forth, then it can live out in the environment in a free state, and then it can also, these spores that come off of that mold, we can breathe them in, and it can cause an infection, because once it gets in the body, it can then go back to this yeast form. So it's going back and forth. The dimorphic fungi goes back from yeast. So in the environment, it's a mold, and then inside the body, it's a yeast. And so sometimes we call that mold phase of it, we call it the 25-degree centigrade phase, because that means that's like room temperature. And then 37, which is body temperature, is the form that it exists as a yeast. So it's actually the temperature change and that can induce it to change from a mold to a yeast. So do you have any questions about that, Letty?
No, so far.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so that, and again, as you go along and you study the chapters that we have all of the diseases, the last thing we did, keep that in mind, because you will occasionally see that word dimorphic, and so that's what that means. And again, those are the organisms that will often give us the most problem because of them being able to be free in the environment and then be taken in and cause disease. Okay? Now, I want to emphasize the protozoans and make sure that you remember about the protozoans. Now, the first thing is that this is a general term for the protozoans. We have 4 different categories of them, and the categories are based on how they are able to move. But most of the protozoans can exist in 2 forms. Now, some can't, but most of them can exist in 2 forms. And the trophozoite is the motile feeding stage. So this is like, if you look at it under the microscope, you'll be able to see it move. You can see it get food and eat. But it also has, most of them also have another form called a cyst, and this is what is known as the dormant or resting stage. The advantage to the protozoan to have this cyst stage, as I said, not all of them do, but the advantage is that when there are poor conditions for it to do what it, the movement and the feeding, it can just go into this stage and it can actually remain alive, but it's not moving, it's not eating, it's just in that resting stage. And so then when conditions change, like moisture, temperature, the availability of nutrients, when those conditions change, then it goes back to that motile feeding stage. Again, the significance to us, as worrying about human disease, is that the cyst stage is the really infective stage, and that means that if one individual has the organism, and usually it's spread by the fecal-oral route, so it's shed into the feces. And so the feces go out into the environment. Again, those conditions aren't so good, but it will go into that cyst stage. And then the next host comes along, and the cysts are there, and then they ingest the cysts, and then when that protozoan gets into the body, then it can convert into that trophozoite phase. So the cysts are still infective, even though they're not moving and eating, they're still infective. So that's just one important piece of information. Now, here are the 4 classes of the protozoans here. And so you see, these are kind of the more scientific words to describe them. But I think for you, we can just key in on the second word. So we have Sarcodyna up here, and those are the amoeba. And the amoeba move by something called pseudopodia or pseudopod. And so what that is the organism stretches out its cytoplasm and it moves. So it will stretch out that cytoplasm, and then the rest of the organism follows it. And so that's the way that it moves. Now, there are other organisms like the Cilia, which is called Siliaphara, but they move by cilia, and sometimes you'll see the word ciliate, C-I-L-I-A-T-E, instead of using the Siliaphara, we'll just say a ciliate. So that also means the protozoan that travels by cilia. And so those organisms have these hair-like structures all around them. And so the hairs kind of go into a wave, and that enables them to move about. And then the Mastigophora, which is the one that can move by a flagella, it will have, and it may have more than one. There's, some of them, like Giardia, have 6 flagella, and it's a whip-like motion, and it enables it to move around. And again, we usually don't use this, but you should know these terms as well. But a lot of times it'll be referred to as a flagellate with the ATE on the end. So when you're looking at something in the test, you see flagellate, then, and that's one of the things we're going to go over, is kind of reminding ourselves of all of the organisms and that basic information about each one of them. So when you see that flagellate, we only had 2 organisms that we studied that were in that category, and we had a couple in this next category. Okay, so the last one is a sporozoan, and the sporozoan is non-modal, so it doesn't really have any form of locomotion. And so it is a non-modal protozoan, and we had a couple in that category. And so that's the last one. And so a lot of times, for example, like Cryptosporidium, you'll just see it, and it's just an oval organism, and it floats, and that's all it does. It doesn't really move on its own.